Welcome to the Modern Mexico Podcast. I'm your host, Nathaniel Parish. On today's podcast, we're taking a look at Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum and the immense challenge she faces when it comes to improving security in Mexico. Shortly after Sheinbaum's victory in the 2024 presidential election, policy analysts and journalists started trying to assess Sheinbaum's plans for reducing violent crime and tackling the organized crime groups that operate in many parts of Mexico. In the U.S., ABC News covered the story.
For the past 6 years, Mexico's official cartel strategy has been hugs, not bullets, and it isn't working very well. Cartel warfare is leaving a trail of more than 20,000 bodies every year, many times hanging from bridges or tossed into mass graves. Tonight, the question is, will a new president of Mexico stop the carnage?
During the first few months of her presidency, Sheinbaum has promised to continue many of the security policies of her predecessor, Manuel Lopez Obrador, but she's also promised to take steps to improve the quality of police work in Mexico. In the spring of 2025, Sheinbaum has been tested by the revelation of a mass grave site in the state of Jalisco in western Mexico, and allegations that state-level government officials and even Mexico's federal government may have suppressed information about the story and prevented an investigation into the site. France 24 covered the story.
Just a few meters beyond the entrance of this now cordoned-off ranch in the Mexican state of Jalisco, the horrors of one of the country's most notorious drug cartels are being unearthed. It's here deep underground that the Warrior Searchers of Jalisco, a collective that helps find missing people, discovered a makeshift crematorium. What they found inside confirmed what authorities feared most. The collective believes the remains are those of people who've disappeared in this state. It's on this ranch that Jalisco New Generation Cartel recruited and trained dozens of people against their will. It's recently been designated a terrorist organization by US President Donald Trump. One of the most powerful in all of Mexico, the cartel is accused of trafficking drugs and people across the country and internationally. Some testimony also suggests the ranch was used for organ trafficking too. Police had taken control of this piece of land last September in an operation that led to the arrest of 10 people, the release of 2 hostages and the discovery of a body. It's just the tip of the iceberg. Authorities say hundreds may have been killed here. Some 200 pairs of shoes were found at the ranch. Jalisco has been the hardest hit by Mexico's disappearance crisis. The state has 15,000 missing people.
On today's podcast, we're talking about Sheinbaum's security policies and assessing her efforts to deal with organized crime groups in Mexico. Today, we're speaking with Will Freeman, a Latin America expert from the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Hi, Will. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Nate. Thanks so much for having me.
So, I wanted to start off the conversation by asking you, I know that Donald Trump has claimed that Mexico's government is working directly with cartels, and I wanted to ask how you would classify that statement. Are those facts? Is it fake news, or is it it's complicated situation?
I'd say it's complicated. Look, I think that government, that's a pretty broad term. It raises some questions. What part of government? What level of government? All of government? Just part of it? And that's why I say it's complicated, because I think to grow and expand the way it has in Mexico, organized crime needed some degree of state protection. Nowhere in the world does organized crime grow as powerful as it is in Mexico without that. But I think that the type of state protection, who's providing it, the degree to which it's being provided, that's changed over time. So you have to go back a bit into the country's history. From the 40s to the 60s, there's good historical evidence that governors were primarily the ones protecting organized crime, as it was, really starting to grow, as the transnational drug trafficking industry was starting to grow. Tom Long and Ben Smith have done great research on this. Later in the final decades of the pre-system in Mexico, the one-party rule, it was federal law enforcement that was doing more of the protection. And then with democratization, as Sandra Ley and Guillermo Trejo have shown, among others, the protection from the state became much more fluid and ad hoc. So instead of mostly governors or mostly federal law enforcement, different groups were going to different state authorities to get protection for what they were doing. Sometimes it was mayors, sometimes it was governors. Alliances would change, and I think that that's the system basically that remains in place today. I will say that I think the local level of government is far more important and often more clearly allied with organized crime in Mexico than the federal, top highest levels of government. That's not to say that there haven't been some concerning cases. You could think of the fact that Genaro Garcia Luna, the former public security secretary for all of Mexico, he's today in U.S. federal prison for narco trafficking. There's also the case of general and former head of the army Salvador Cienfuegos, who was arrested in the U.S. on suspicion of drug trafficking, was then returned to Mexico. But prosecutors, did have they claim evidence against him. So that's pretty high level. But what I think we see more often is this more local level protection, more local level alliances. You have 5 governors in Mexico over the last decade who've been jailed domestically for ties to organized crime. You have 2 more governors extradited to the United States in that time for crime ties. That means we're talking about a fifth of all states in Mexico having had a narco governor in just the past decade. So that speaks to some really broad local level alliances, I think. Now I think what the claim gets wrong is that it makes it sound like there's some sweeping national deal between authorities in Mexico and the cartels, quote unquote. We don't have any evidence, any smoking gun evidence, I guess I'd say, that a recent Mexican president has personally greenlit or overseen such an alliance. But I think these pervasive ties at the local level, they do raise the question. I mean, how can the president in Mexico not know with all the intelligence that he or she has access to? If we're talking about, 5 or 6 governors from sometimes the governing party having these deals, how is it that one president after the next hasn't known? And so I think that, that probably motivated some of the frustration that you could see evident in that Trump administration statement, right? I think, the Trump administration is not the first U.S. administration to be frustrated that this kind of collusion continues in Mexico, rarely with any kind of consequences. And finally, I would just say that I think in a few places, the relationship's gone much further than an alliance. So an alliance kind of suggests you help me, I help you. I think sometimes that's the relationship between politicians and cartels in Mexico. But I think sometimes it goes further. Sometimes they fuse, and you see the emergence of local narco states. Places where the state government, local government is one and the same, really, with the drug traffickers. And so we could talk about specific places this has happened. I think one of them you'd have to argue is the state of Nayarit on the Pacific coast, under the former Attorney General, until very recently in U.S. federal prison for narco trafficking, Edgar Beitia. We could get more into that, but just to make the point that there are certain places, I think, where you do see this relationship going even further.
So I think you made some great points there. It sounds like when we look at the state level or the municipal level in Mexico, we do have more clear evidence and even some convictions regarding collaboration or collusion between politicians and organized crime groups. But when it comes to the national government, it seems like we have allegations and we have questions, but we don't have that clear picture in the same way that we do at the state level in different places in Mexico. And I know that for a lot of people looking at Mexico, there are definitely a lot of questions about whether the hands-off, hugs not bullets policy that former President Lopez Obrador implemented, whether it also entailed turning a blind eye to some kinds of organized crime activity, be it money laundering or drug trafficking or extortion or cargo truck hijacking or any number of other things. But overall, as I said, I think it seems like we do have a clearer picture about the collusion that's going on at the state and local level. I wanted to take a short break from the podcast to remind listeners that I'm always looking to connect with executives and entrepreneurs who are trying to understand modern Mexico. So if that sounds like you, please don't hesitate to contact me. I also wanted to ask you, when you look at the situation overall of organized crime in Mexico right now, I wanted to know, what 3 words would you pick to describe the current role that organized crime plays in Mexico?
I'm really glad you asked that question because I think in the public discussion of this problem and a lot of the writing on it, uh, it's almost like the analysis skips past this first step of just describing what are we dealing with, right? So you hear drug cartels, some places you hear gangs, but what are these groups, really doing in practice? What are they? And so I'll put 3 words to it, 3 phrases. So the first is a business lobby, which might sound very bureaucratic and stuffy, but I think it's important to frame it that way. A business lobby uses the tools at its disposal to try to get authorities to implement regulations or take away regulations that favor its ability to make profits, right? I think that's what we see organized crime doing, using violence, corruption, assassinations, extermination camps. You go down the list. I mean, using all these tools. I think that's what we see them doing in Mexico. After all, these crime groups are profit maximizing businesses. They don't have to obey any labor standards, competition laws. They don't have to pay taxes, at least not formally. Maybe you could consider the bribes they pay taxes. And so to continue operating, they have to lobby, a critical mass of state officials, be they local or state police, mayors, governors, to get them to turn a blind eye or actually actively cooperate in their profit-making ventures. So I think it's useful to think of them that way, right? To not lose sight of the fact that at the end of the day, that's their goal, to maximize profits, and that they have lobbying tactics that they use to do it. Okay, second, I would say that they are mercenaries. And I say mercenaries because obviously their main objective is to increase their own profits. But I think there's also a marketplace for violence in Mexico, and that you see these groups often selling the service of violence to other actors, right? Be they political, business, etc. The Mexican journalist Oscar Valderas recently wrote that, the country is seeing the kind of end of a phase of cartels and the beginning of a rise of what he calls brazos armados, or armed wings. Armed wings are guns for hire. They are armed groups that do the bidding of those who pay them. I think that's also an element of what we're seeing in Mexico. And it's not a coincidence that the most recent elections were the most violent in Mexican history. I mean, recent Mexican history, you saw, the armed, really, criminal groups around the country acting as armed factions for certain candidacies. And then finally, I would say that beyond either of just these 2 concepts, business lobby or mercenaries, I think organized crime has become in Mexico what I'd call a parallel power. And by that, I mean an unelected force that wields real authority over, the economy, the justice system, politics, people's lives at the end of the day. Kind of the idea of living in a democracy is that you elect the people that make the decisions that bear on your life, or at least, a good number of them, the, people who at the end of the day are the ones making the critical decisions. The idea of a parallel power is that it's a totally unelected force that usurps that authority, right? And I think that's what crime has done in many parts of Mexico. It has become this domineering parallel power that ultimately, decides questions of life and death for a lot of people. That's why, for me, it's hard to argue that Mexico is a full democracy. And, not only for the reasons of kind of eroding checks and balances at the top, which is how the way most people write about Mexico's democracy, at least in English. But for me, because of these unelected criminal figures, who are wielding such unconstrained power. And I just underscore that, this combination of business lobby, mercenaries, and parallel power is massively destabilizing to the country. Over 275,000 Mexicans have been killed by organized crime since 2007. That's the estimate of Lantia Intelligence, an analysis firm. You have some Mexican states like Zacatecas with higher rates of forced disappearance than, Latin America's 1970 military dictatorships, than the infamous dirty wars of that period. And so I think there's just no understating how broadly destabilizing organized crime, as it fills these three roles, has become, right? It's not just one among many issues, at least for me in Mexico. It's, if you look at it objectively, it's the issue.
So I think that's a really helpful framework for understanding the current trends in organized crime in Mexico. And in particular, I think the concepts of a business lobby and a parallel power are very helpful for understanding some of the dynamics that we're seeing at the local level in different parts of the country. Overall, we know that former President Lopez Obrador earned the unfortunate distinction of having the most violent sexennial or 6-year period in modern Mexico's history. And I think that both the former president and the current president, Claudia Sheinbaum, like to point out that even though the overall levels of violence might remain high, overall, year by year, the total number of homicides does seem to be going down. But I also know that there are states such as Veracruz where this drop in murders seems to have occurred alongside an increase in many other types of organized crime activity. And on episodes 14 and 21 of the podcast, we talked about the security dynamic in Veracruz. And I know that you recently went to the nearby state of Tabasco, and I wanted to ask about the trends you saw there and how they compare to the national picture in Mexico.
Yeah, well, first I would just say on your observation that murders can go down while other types of crime go up. Earlier, I mentioned that case of Nayarit under Edgar Beitia and Roberto Sandoval, a genuine narco state, and that was the case there. In the first years of their rule, although not forever, murders plummeted. But meanwhile, extortion, kidnapping, those were going up, and as it turned out, often perpetrated by the state itself. So. Yeah, I appreciate that attention to detail. But on the case of Tabasco, I was there right after the elections last year, and yeah, I would say that compared to the national picture, Tabasco doesn't get a ton of attention. It's not the major operating hub of a cartel like a place like Sinaloa that's constantly in the news right now. But I found it pretty informative to spend some time there because I think there you have a real surge in violence caused by more what I would call disorganized crime. You have a lot of small local gangs heavily involved in supplying the local drug demand, which unfortunately we don't know much about the AMLO government. I mean, one among many counterproductive steps it took was to cancel the drug use survey in Mexico. So we no longer have data on really or even estimates of what use patterns look like. But I can tell you from interviewing, everybody from public school teachers there to young folks to civil society leaders that use of meth especially is a major problem. Use of other drugs, and there are local distribution networks that have formed to supply that. Not to mention, pervasive local extortion, which has just boomed in recent years. The extortion of local businesses, even in a very poor state. So what you have going on there is you have all these local, kind of puny groups fighting for power, and then over the last several years, the Jalisco New Generation cartel pushing into the state and very aggressively, not seeking to dominate these pre-existing groups, but actually just eliminating them wholesale. I mean, going drug distribution point by drug distribution point through the city of Villahermosa and murdering these previous dealers. So I think that explains why it's been one of the states with kind of the biggest recent surges in violence. In some surveys I've seen, Villahermosa is the state capital with the highest perceptions of insecurity in the whole country. I certainly felt that pervasive feeling of insecurity when I was there. Recently, not that long before I was there, the state public security secretary's house was surrounded by gunmen, and they just rained gunfire on it. He himself accused in the 2022 Guacamaya leaks, leak of military intelligence documents of having cut deals with the Jalisco New Generation cartel. But yeah, I mean, to take a step back, I think that the other way that the situation in Tabasco speaks to a national problem is, going back to the early 2000s, let's say, organized crime and organized crime violence in Mexico were really serious problems close to the U.S.-Mexico border and along kind of major highways, pieces of infrastructure important for transnational drug trafficking. Tabasco is pretty marginal to that whole story, right? But it's not marginal to fuel, for instance, major hub for Pemex and for refineries. Dos Bocas is there. Increasingly, despite the fact that it's like other southern states like Chiapas, not at all close to the U.S. border, it's become subsumed in this kind of violence. So I really worry about it because, some other states in Mexico, they may have more resources to combat this problem, to at least try to strengthen local law enforcement. But states like Chiapas, Tabasco, most of the South, are very deprived. And I also worry about the possibility for real increases in forced migration there. We've seen a lot of forced displacement already in Chiapas, so we know this can happen. But as crime intensifies, as extortion goes up in these already quite impoverished southern states, people just have very little margin to survive that. When I was in Tabasco, I already, heard about tons of people leaving certain towns, mostly fleeing to Yucatan for its perceived safety, for places like Merida, which are much safer. But, you have to wonder how long until people decide it's, maybe it's better to head towards the United States.
So I know that I've seen a number of recent news stories about pretty wild gun battles in Tabasco, as well as some reports of violent carjackings and cargo truck hijackings. So it seems like some of the trends in Tabasco that you're talking about might mirror the bigger picture of what's going on in Mexico, in particular when it comes to the trend of the splintering and diversification of organized crime groups. And when we look at the big picture in Mexico, I wanted to ask you, what grade would you give President Sheinbaum for her strategy in dealing with Mexico's organized crime groups?
Yeah, well, let me give her two grades. I mean, one, let me kind of grade her on the curve of Mexico's recent past and also the region today, which I'd say in both cases, we don't see a ton of inspiring examples of really effective efforts to curb organized crime. You see some, but not many. So I'm going to grade her on a very realistic standard, and then I'll tell you my grade, just kind of in absolute terms. So I'd say on this curve, I would give Sheinbaum so far a B plus, which I think if you look at the presidency of Enrique Peña Nieto and Lopez Obrador, you had real scaling back of especially towards the latter years of Peña Nieto and during almost the whole of AMLO, at least up until the last couple of years, you had a real scaling back of state authority. I think the state looking decreasingly able to deter organized crime. Detentions of people for organized crime were dropping. Seizures of guns were dropping. You in the same time, unsurprisingly, had violence going up. I think this was kind of two Mexican governments in a row really being lost, not knowing how to course correct from the Felipe Calderon years, in which there was this really frontal attack on the cartels, which splintered them, caused eventually a big increase in violence. And I think you just had sort of a directionlessness after that. Mexican politicians saw that didn't work, but they didn't replace it with something more effective. And increasingly under AMLO, it looked like they were replacing it with a sort of unspoken tacit truce, a sort of agreement not to meddle with the crime groups and hope that that let the country stabilize. Now, I think what we were clearly seeing by the end of AMLO is the country was not stabilizing, right? So by 2022, you get this kind of, I would say, very quiet, almost secretive shift away from this abrazos no balazos policy, and the AMLO government starting to detain more people, seize more weapons, disrupt the logistics networks of these groups, and cooperate, more willingly with the United States. 2022 on, and why I think Sheinbaum so far compared to that record deserves a B plus is because I've seen her double down on those positive trends. This effort to reassert state authority and actually kind of expand it in new ways. So just to mention a few examples, I mean, you have her expelling 29 drug traffickers from the country, legally questionable how she did it, but she expelled them to the United States. I think that sends a pretty powerful message. You have her to some extent rebuilding civilian institutions, giving civilian officials more power in terms of intelligence gathering, collection. You have her getting together with governors in the state of in the city of Acapulco and telling them, you really you have to stop passing the buck and doing the thing governors often do in Mexico and local officials more broadly, where they say, well, organized crime isn't technically under my jurisdiction. That's it's a federal crime. I can't handle it. And she's also appointed Omar Garcia Harfuch, the public security secretary, and he's done things like help detain state police accused of narco corruption, even in places governed by Morena, like Estado de Mexico or Chiapas. So I see all that as pretty positive. Honestly, I'm probably surprised in a positive direction about what we're seeing so far. And, I think whether or not it's because of this kind of deterrence, this focus on the organized crime issue, or because of organized crime infighting, we're seeing, fentanyl seizures drop pretty precipitously at the U.S.-Mexico border. So suggesting that the crime groups are able to move or choosing to move less fentanyl, that's undoubtedly good. I think we're seeing some blowback to these policies, some increase in violence in certain parts of the country, but not a sort of wave of violence and criminal fragmentation like you saw during the Calderon years, at least so far. And I think probably the most positive thing is it seems Sheinbaum is still going after these mid-levels of these organizations rather than just decapitating them, which we kind of know doesn't work. But now let me tell you why I would give Sheinbaum something closer to a C or maybe even a D if you're just looking at it in absolute terms. And that's because of, I think, the two biggest unresolved questions of her security policy. The two things that make me really question whether she has what it takes and whether she's committed to reasserting state authority in Mexico, really curbing these groups. So one is that I haven't seen her so far assert a strategy for holding accountable governors and mayors who collaborate with organized crime. It kind of goes back to that very first issue we were talking about, these local level alliances, which seem to have become so pervasive. Now, I think that's very politically tricky for Claudia Sheinbaum. Earlier, we were talking about Tabasco. The governor of Tabasco for many of the last years was Adán Augusto Lopez. Today, he's one of the most powerful figures within her party, Morena. And in the Guacamaya leaks, the military intelligence documents, allege that he cooperated with the Jalisco New Generation cartel to let it into Tabasco and give it government influence over that state government. So for someone like Sheinbaum, I mean, confronting these governors, ones with really serious allegations of organized crime collusion, like the ex-governor of Morelos, Cuauhtemoc Blanco, or like the governor of Sinaloa, Rocha Moya. This is going to be tough for her, right? It risks dividing her party. It risks maybe the disapproval of her predecessor and mentor, AMLO. Politically, it's not necessarily the smartest thing to do, but it's absolutely necessary to do if you want to weaken these groups. They can't have protectors as powerful as governors. If that's the case, you're probably never going to weaken them. And the second reason I give her a low grade, and I am worried about her ultimate commitment, is the question of the fiscalias, or the prosecutor's offices, both federal and state in Mexico. To me, this is the most broken institution in Mexico. It's the biggest barrier to fighting crime. I mean, you and I think many listeners of the podcast will be aware that impunity rates for all types of crime in Mexico, often hover north of 90%, both on the state and federal level. Very few crimes ultimately get prosecuted. You could point to judges, police as part of that problem, but ultimately, if you don't have prosecutors bringing charges, you can't do anything about impunity, right? Crimes will just go unpunished. I think we could get into it. There are a lot of reasons that the prosecutor's offices don't work well, and why they're so often captured by political, business, and criminal interests in Mexico. But the important thing here is, what is Claudia Sheinbaum prepared to do about it? And I just focus in on this recent discovery, which is all over the news right now, of an extermination site with a crematorium in part of the state of Jalisco. At first, Claudia Sheinbaum came out and said, how can it be that the state Fiscalia of Jalisco said that they'd taken charge of this site in September. They, were controlled the property. They were going to hunt for evidence on it. And we just heard nothing, right? And then just a week ago, you have victims, advocates, volunteers find their way onto the property and discover this horrific scene of hundreds of pairs of shoes of victims who were presumably killed there. Clearly just the site of a mass killing field. The state Fiscalia of Jalisco was sitting on it the whole time. I mean, how can that be? And at first, President Sheinbaum said, we need answers about what was going on within the Fiscalia there. But more recently, she said that all the media attention, I mean, the whole discussion of this killing field is, a plot to undermine her government. And that really concerns me. I think the first message she started with, which was essentially, we need to get to the bottom of the impunity that made this possible and that may have been involved in covering it up. That was the right one. That's the commitment she needs to display when dealing with the justice system all across the country. But this second, more recent message is really concerning, and it looks a lot more like AMLO, like her predecessor.
So a grade of a C or a D definitely doesn't sound like a resounding endorsement of what you're seeing from Sheinbaum and her security policies.
Well, I would just say that if you'd asked me about Peña, Nieto, or AMLO, it would have been closer to an F. So relative improvements.
Right. So yeah, you definitely mentioned there are some positive trends that you are watching, but overall, your comments seem to be in line with things that I have heard from other people, which is an assessment that Sheinbaum does have some positive ideas about security and is doing some positive things, but overall, her security package is not a game-changing program that is going to totally transform Mexico. It's not a new deal for security or anything like that. And I've always thought that's a little bit it's surprising that politicians in Mexico don't focus more on really trying to improve security, because survey data always shows that crime and security issues are always a top concern for residents in different parts of the country. We also know, as we've discussed already today, that in many parts of Mexico, the problem of extortion is increasing, and the federal government's own data shows that extortion has increased quite significantly in the past 5 years. But on the other hand, I also saw a survey recently that I thought was kind of interesting, that showed that over 60% of respondents think that the security dynamic in Mexico is going to improve this year. And if we are going to see improvement, I wondered if you had any advice that you would give President Sheinbaum, and in particular, is there any policy solution that you would advise Sheinbaum to adopt if she wants to counter or limit the role of organized crime in politics?
Yeah, well, I think it goes to that question about those two broken parts of the institutional framework I just mentioned. I mean, the fact local politicians can collude with crime with pretty low consequences, maybe no consequences, and the capture of state prosecutors' offices specifically. So I would give her the advice of she's a very strong president. She has an astounding popularity. She's been able to prevent the fragmentation of Morena far more than I and many others had expected would be possible. She's proving very adept at managing the relationship with Trump. So she's clearly very capable. My advice would be use some of that capacity to make an example of the worst offenders when it comes to prosecutors and perhaps governors that collude with crime. It may be impossible for Mexico to purge or hold accountable every person, every example of a prosecutor, local politician that does that. But I think by making an example and showing there can be consequences for some of the worst offenders, that may have a corrective effect on some of the behavior of the others, right? And it may at least start to raise the costs of that kind of corruption. So the same way that her, crackdown, or rather, better put, the same way that her recent moves to increase detentions, decrease arms seizures, dismantle some of the mid tiers of criminal organizations has actually so far, I think we're seeing reaped benefits in terms of reducing violence. I think the same way, making an example of particularly corrupt prosecutors and local politicians, it may also have a positive downstream consequences. But I will say, and we haven't talked about surprisingly Donald Trump this entire time. There's another big variable which is outside her control, and that is the U.S. Right, the U.S. security policy. Um, Now, to Trump's credit, I think that by putting pressure on Mexico with the threat of tariffs, regardless of what his real aim is with that, which I think we don't really know, but one effect has been that it seems to have uh, encouraged the Sheinbaum government to really double down on some of these positive changes. So I want to give the administration credit there, but also it's an administration that's playing with fire. Namely because it keeps putting on the table this idea of a unilateral military strike on Mexican soil to do something like take out a cartel drug lab. And this is more than an empty threat. There are drones flying over Mexico collecting intelligence. There's Republican sponsored bills on the legislature which would authorize use of military force in Mexico. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has talked about it as a real option they're considering. There are Navy vessels in the now so-called Gulf of America, Gulf of Mexico, able to deploy missiles. I think that any move like that, it will push Claudia Sheinbaum into a corner where she has no opportunity, excuse me, no option, really, but to scale back cooperation with the U.S., perhaps quite a lot. Um, and that would be a very negative, downward spiral for both countries. So that's what worries me, and I need to add that because we've been talking almost as if Mexican security policy and the results on the ground are totally a function of her decisions and her government's decisions. But there's another half to that duo.
Definitely. I think that's a great point, and particularly right now, certainly Donald Trump and his administration will definitely play a big role in what happens in Mexico in terms of both rhetoric and actions regarding organized crime groups in the country. Something else that I am thinking about is just the word impunity when it comes to reducing the role of organized crime in politics in Mexico. I think a key tool to make that happen is just reducing impunity overall. As long as organized crime groups are able to enjoy the protection from local politicians or state governors and able to operate with impunity, it's hard to crack down on them. And I know that in 2023, overall, around 97% of all the murders in Mexico went unsolved. And that's a pretty alarming statistic. And I have spoken to some security analysts who have said that when it comes to crimes like cargo truck hijacking, impunity is one of the biggest factors because it might be there's a relatively small group of individuals that is treating cargo truck hijacking like a full-time job and robbing one or several trucks every single day on different highways in a state in the country. And over the course of a year, that can turn into thousands of hijackings. But it's not the case that there are, thousands of hijackers and operating in different corners of the entire state. It's a relatively small group that's able to operate with impunity. And there is something interesting that I just saw today, which is I know that Sheinbaum had received some accolades for her work in reducing homicide levels in Mexico City while she was mayor. But even towards the end of her term, impunity levels in Mexico City for murder were very, very high, still approaching 100%. But I did see that last year, police and prosecutors in Mexico City did make substantial progress in actually arresting and prosecuting individuals accused of being involved in homicides in the city. So that does seem like it is a positive trend, but it remains to be seen whether that type of success story can be translated onto the national stage. And I also know that overall, Sheinbaum often describes her administration as being a continuation of Lopez Obrador's so-called fourth transformation. And we do have good data on Lopez Obrador's time in office, and a lot of that data points to some pretty worrying trends when it comes to organized crime activity in different states in the country. But at the same time, Sheinbaum is just starting her sexenio, and people in Mexico are going to have to wait and see how successful she is in continuing to reduce homicide levels and how she performs in prosecuting a diverse array of organized crime activity. Overall, I just want to say it was super interesting to hear your perspective on all of this. And I want to say thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Modern Mexico podcast. If you like what you heard in the podcast today, check out my book, Searching for Modern Mexico, which is available on Amazon. The next episode of the podcast is coming soon. Until then, hasta luego, amigos.